It is February 3rd, 2026. It's Tuesday. It's Harp Tuesday. Welcome to this week's episode. So today I want to talk about improvising, and I'm going to use the example of how to improvise around Shepherd's Cradle Song. So I did an episode on this lovely little piece. A few episodes earlier. And at the end of that, I ended up feeling inspired to do a little improvisation. And a patron commented, it would be great to do an episode talking about how to improvise on something like that, how to make it sound good, right? And of course, I'm also been thinking about improvisation because for the last 11 years now, I've done a free improvisation on January 1st to welcome in the new year. And in that case, not just trying to make something up without any context, without the inspiration of, in this case, a piece of music. So before I get into the nitty-gritty of how we might improvise around Shepherd's Cradle Song, I want to just talk a little bit about my experience with improvisation. So I come from very much of a classical background. I don't know that I ever did any improvisation with my teacher, right? It was very much, this is the music and this is how you play it. I certainly did some arrangements, but not just sort of improvising as I played. But eventually, I somehow found that I could improvise, and again, for example, doing these free improvisations, just making something up out of thin air. But of course, in a sense, it's not out of thin air because it's based on all the music I've played and all the music I've heard. And so, again, for me then, my path to feeling quite free to improvise comes from many, many years of playing. So developing good technique, developing some good theory knowledge, all these shapes and pieces and patterns that I've played that are in my fingers, in my brain, and all the music that I've played and also have heard that is in my ear, all of that leads to being able to improvise. So in other words, it's not just, for me, it's not just a quick, do this one simple thing and you'll be able to improvise in a blink of an eye. It just, like a lot of things with music, it can take some time. And again, the better you play, the easier it is to improvise because your hands are just more capable. And again, you can maybe leave something to, left hand to its own devices and improvise around the right hand. Whereas if you are very new to the harp and just the whole thing is hard, it becomes a little bit harder to improvise. Which is not to say that you can't, from any point, try improvising. And I've done some episodes on sort of free improvising and improvising around patterns. Anyway, so just some preamble that, improvising can seem kind of magical. How do people do it? But again, I think it's not a conscious thing. As I'm doing this, I'm not consciously thinking, we'll talk about some theory here, but I'm not consciously really that aware of it. But it is there in the back of my mind. So let's dig into some music theory because I think that's going to be really helpful when we look at improvising around this. So this piece, the first thing that can help make improvising easier when you're looking at improvising on a piece is to look at the chord structure. What is going on harmonically in the piece? So we start here, right? We're playing this chord, this C and E in the right hand and an A in the left hand. So let's get them closer together. Let's, for example, bring this C and E all the way down here. So we have A, C, E. Well, right away, that's pretty easy, right? That's just a root position 3-note A chord, A minor. And in fact, this piece is in the key of C, but in fact, it's in the key of A minor, right? The relative minor, always a third down from the major key. And we start with an A minor, we end with an A minor, all makes sense. So we're going to write A minor. Great. So A minor, this E is probably part of the same A minor. Here we only have two E's and a C, so in other words, C and E, we can get rid of the duplicated note. Again, this could be part of a C major chord. Well, not with our G sharp, but it could be if we had a G natural. But we're going to assume this is all A minor. So that first bar is A minor. Then we start second bar. Well, this we assume is A minor, right? So the beginning of the bar is A minor. Then we have that same E, which could definitely be part of A minor. But this chord here in the right hand, that B and D, neither of them are part of an A minor chord. It could be part of a G chord, if we had the G natural. Could be part of a D minor if we had an F sharp, a B minor. Or maybe some sort of seventh chord, right? Aha, could be part of this E7 chord. We have that G sharp, so it's an E major chord, but not an E major 7, which would require a D sharp, but just a normal E7. It could be, but I think what's much more likely is it's a so-called passing tone. So in other words, sometimes as we move in one direction or another, we glide along some notes that are not part in the melody, they're not part of the chordal structure, but that don't require a change in chords to accompany them, that we can keep the same A minor underneath that note, even though it doesn't belong in the A minor. So I think we can assume it's still A minor for the first half of the bar. So A minor. And now here we have an E, a G sharp, and a B. Oh, perfect. That again is just a root position triad, an E chord, E major. So we can say that this is E. Okay, and then this is back to our A minor. Oh, and then this must be our E again. And our A minor, there's that same passing tone, and E. Ha ha. So we have a bar of A minor to start with. I'm just going to play an A chord here just so we see that it sounds okay with what the melody is doing. A minor still. E. Back to A minor. Back to E. Back to A minor. E. All sounding good. Okay. What happens here is we start the second line. Well, we have an A in the right hand and an A in the left hand. Now, on their own, of course, they don't really tell us anything. So if we're looking at a normal chord, not a seventh chord, or a suspended chord or an add 9 or anything, that A could be part of an A minor chord, could be part of an F major chord, could be part of a D minor chord, right? Could be any of those. But given the context of this piece, I think we can safely assign this to A minor. We got the same little left-hand pattern. A minor is definitely going to sound good. We could change it up, of course, but I think for now we're just going to call this A minor. A minor. Now we could change here. So this could be, again, this could be an E chord, or maybe an E7. I'm going to put an E in parentheses here. We could change, but then we're definitely back to this A minor. And again, this chord, this G sharp B, could be part of an E chord, right? Or it could just be a passing tone. So again, we could be changing every beat here. We could go A minor, E, or this whole bar could just be A minor. Then we get A minor. Again, I think we can assume that this is just a passing tone. This whole bar is A minor. Great. Still A minor. Again, I think it's passing tones. Oh, E. Great. Again, we could like go A minor, E if we wanted to. E, of course, on the next beat, and then A minor here. But I think that's not really what we're going to do, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And then the final bar is A minor the whole way through. Great. So let's figure out exactly what we want to do with this first bar, the second line. Do we want to go A minor, E, A minor, E? So let's try with the chords. to E minor here as well. E major here as well. We can do E, as I say, we can do E here as well. E as well. Back to A maybe. That's A. We could be changing back and forth. But I think, especially when we're improvising, it's nice to keep things fairly simple. And what looks to be nice here would be to have a chord every half note, right? 2 chords per bar. We could do a little drone effect like that. And in other words, not to have changes that happen more faster than a half note. So we're not, I'm going to make the executive decision not to change to E major in the middle of that bar. So it'll just be A minor. So maybe I will do a little bit of color coding here. So we've got this A minor that lasts all the way to here. And then we've got E for half a beat. We've also got E for half a beat here, E for half a beat here, and then E for half a beat here. And then we've got the A minor, boom, boom, all the way along to here and at the end. So you can see that the 2 lines are not exactly the same, right? That's very clear with the visual there that we've done. But it's only 2 chords, and that's beautiful. So that is a reason why this particular piece kind of works very well as an improvisation, because that makes it quite easy for the left hand. It's just these 2 chords, this A minor and this E. Now, something else to be aware of is that the note E is shared by both A minor and by E, E major. So we could play an E the entire way through and it will work with what the right hand's doing, right? Let's say we play an E, just a single E or an E octave. We could improvise a little bit by maybe playing the right hand it's written and playing around a little bit with the rhythm of the left hand by just playing E's. That's going to sound good, right? We don't even have to worry about changing from A to E, even though it's just 2 chords. We can just stick with that E, that little drone, and play around with that. Great. So now we have our basic sort of context there of what is kind of going on underneath the chords. Of course, we could keep this little pattern as we're improvising. It's a little bit tricky because we're not connecting, so it would be nicer if we were doing, but the problem is sometimes this note would have to be a note that belongs with an E chord. So it's not necessarily ideal. Could work, but not ideal. But again, I think just kind of nice to be aware of the chord that we're playing. All right, now, also before we start improvising, I would put all the G's to sharp. So we'd put the harp in the key of C and then put all the G's to sharp, not just this single G, so that we have that E major chord no matter where we are, and it's just going to sound better to every time we play a G to have it be sharp. Okay, great. Well, that's nice, but now how about improvising, right? So one thing you can do, again, to kind of get into it is to just play the piece a few times. Maybe experiment with some chords. So the beautiful thing about improvising is that even if you play a note that's wrong, so at some point I was going, and I played an F, which is not part of an A minor or an E, but I just kept going. And so, the classic saying in jazz is that there's no wrong note, it's the next note that makes that previous note correct, right? That we can always kind of adjust and go with it. And when I repeated and started again, what I was doing was not what I kind of expected to be doing. But if you just are able to roll with it somehow, it can sound great, right? Like that no matter what's happening, if you can keep going and find some more notes and find some more notes and find some more notes, maybe it will work out. So in this case, being aware of this chord sequence so that if at some point in this bar of A, so here we have this A, bar of A, right? If I can arrive at an A, part of an A chord somewhere in there, an A or C or an E, that's going to sound good. Again, you could be saying, okay, I'm going to start the bar as written. And try and grab some spots where you're like, okay, I'm messing around. Now I'm going to join back up with the written note, for example. Now the nice thing here is if we look at these two chords, A and E, they share an E, right? But so that's the notes G, A, B, C, E. And if we think about this E as potentially being an E7, that gets us a D as well. So now we have G, A, B, C, D, E. We're just missing an F. So the F is the note that's maybe going to stick out the most, and in this piece is written, there are no Fs, right, whenever playing an F. But you can see that all the rest of the strings we can possibly play are going to sound like they belong to one of these two chords, right? Considering that D can definitely sound like part of the E chord. So the F is the least part of the chords, then the D, and then the rest are part of one or the other chord. So that's beautiful. So that like let's say we play these chords. It sounds not half bad, just kind of wandering up and down some scales there, for example. So again, you could of course try and analyze it, and we can say, trying to do something similar but a little bit different. One of the things that can work quite well is to try and do the same rhythm but playing different notes, right? So maybe if we start out the same, now keep the same rhythm here. I ended up with kind of a weird chord there because it's not part of this E minor, but that's okay, we'll make it work. It's a different chord but the same rhythm. And then we're going to have the same rhythm here. Great, I ended up with a written note there. Same rhythm here. So I kept the same rhythm, and I often was doing a little bit different, maybe a third higher, but it doesn't have to be a third higher. Let's say we go second higher, which is a little bit weird, but second higher is going to have a hard time always sounding like the piece itself, but I could do some of those and then end up back with something that sounded like it belonged to the chord and belonged to the piece, right? So that sounded like the piece. If you've been hearing the piece and then hear that, it's still going to sound the same, or it's still going to sound like it's part of that. It's an improvisation. It's a variation. So again, depending on how comfortable you're feeling, maybe you end up trying just to improvise a little bit around with the right hand. Or, it might be too much to try to think about both hands, or keep that drone going, right? That maybe that E, or you could try this written pattern. Again, the E here can potentially interfere a little bit with what we might be doing with the right hand. Maybe you're comfortable that the E is shared by both, so if all else fails, we're playing some chords, we can play that E. And it doesn't, in a way, matter if we exactly follow the chord structure here. Again, the nice thing about this being only 2 chords is if we stay on the A or if we stay on the E, it's not going to be the end of the world. So let me kind of close with, I think, what is one of the most important things is keeping the pulse going, keeping the breath going. So, when we play a melodic instrument, when we play a pitched instrument, that rather than percussion, it's so easy. We often get caught up so much about playing the correct notes, playing the correct pitch, hearing the correct sounds. But music, in many ways, the essence of music is the pulse, is the beat, is the rhythm. And so you get this effect where playing the right notes, but at the wrong time, without a sense of the pulse, is much worse to listen to than playing the wrong notes, but with the correct pulse. So if we play this, like as written, right? Playing the correct notes. That's not so inviting to listen to, right? Because it doesn't have a pulse. Whereas if we play some terribly wrong notes, also a bit strange to listen to as well, but it's the pulse keeps us going, and we can always, again, we can always recover a little bit and end with some nice notes. So as you're improvising, the most important thing is to keep the breath, the pulse going. In this particular case, I think we can have a very steady pulse, kind of almost metronomic, right? You could be playing along with a metronome if you wanted to really help keep this 1, 2. again, a lot of the notes there weren't particularly amazing notes, I don't think, but by keeping the pulse going, that makes or breaks the piece. And again, remember, when you're doing this on your own, you're the only one listening, right? So it doesn't matter how it sounds, just enjoy it. And again, really try and keep that pulse going. So I definitely encourage you to do something like that. This is a great example. This is a great piece, right? With a very, just two chords and a nice little melody. And basically anything we play is going to sound atmospheric, going to sound good. So to do something like that and just mess around with it, right? And see what happens. So I hope you enjoyed that. I will see you soon for another episode of Harp Tuesday. Cheers.